I never meant to stare, but she saw me, and smiled like she'd been waiting for it. It started as nothing more than a passing glance, one of those moments you don't expect to linger in your mind. I had just moved into the neighborhood, a small, tree-lined street where the evenings were always quieter than I was used to. Boxes still sat unopened in my living room, the faint smell of fresh paint clinging to the walls, when I noticed her for the first time. Across the street, on the second floor, a woman was tending to her balcony plants. The sunset poured behind her like a soft fire, painting the sky with burnt orange and rose gold. She looked to be in her early 40s, elegant in a way that didn't ask for attention but drew it anyway. Her hair caught the light with every small movement, and the loose sleeves of her linen blouse moved gently in the evening breeze. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just adjusting a pot of lavender, brushing soil from her hands, but the stillness she carried made the scene feel deliberate, almost cinematic. I don't know why I lingered at the window. Maybe it was the way the fading sun outlined her profile, or maybe it was the quiet focus she had, like the world around her moved slower by choice. My fingers rested on the windowsill, gripping it lightly, as if the wood itself could steady me. I told myself I wasn't staring, just observing. But my eyes didn't want to move. Then she turned. It wasn't a sudden, jarring movement, more like the natural drift of someone aware of being watched before they even see you. Her eyes found mine across the narrow street, calm, unhurried, and, if I'm honest, unreadable. For a second, I thought she might smile. Instead, her head tilted slightly, as though she were taking a mental note of me the same way I was of her. The air between our windows felt heavier than it had a moment ago. The late summer breeze carried the scent of her plants, something floral but grounded, like rosemary and lavender steeped in warmth. I felt the oddest tension in my chest, the kind that comes from being caught off guard, exposed in a harmless yet intimate way. After a heartbeat or two, she reached for the sheer curtain at her side and drew it, not all the way, just enough to veil half the balcony. A quiet statement. She saw me, but she wasn't retreating completely. The space she left uncovered felt intentional, as if to say, "You may look, just not too much." I stepped back from my window then, a little embarrassed at how still I had been. Yet as I turned toward the half-unpacked room, I caught myself glancing back. Her silhouette was still there, a faint shape behind the light fabric, moving slowly among the plants. That was the first moment I realized she wasn't just a neighbor. She was a presence, one that didn't have to speak to make me curious, one that, even from across the street, had already unsettled the quiet I thought I wanted. It was a week after I first noticed her. Long enough for the memory of that sunset moment to settle somewhere in the back of my mind, but not long enough for it to fade. I told myself I wasn't looking out for her, not really, just living my life, running errands, figuring out my new neighborhood. But there she was again. I had just stepped out of the corner store, a paper bag of small essentials in hand, coffee, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk tucked under my arm, when I heard a soft thud followed by a scattered roll of something across the pavement. I turned, and saw her kneeling by the curb, one of her grocery bags torn at the seam, apples spilling like marbles in every direction. She wasn't flustered, at least not outwardly. Her movements were calm, deliberate, like this was just another small inconvenience in her day. I crouched beside her without really thinking. "Here, let me help," I said, reaching for one of the runaway apples. Our hands met over the same one. Just for a second. Her skin was cool, smooth, her fingers slender but steady against mine. A brush, really, barely a touch, but enough to send a quiet jolt up my arm, the kind you don't expect from something so ordinary. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and warm, carrying that same composed ease I'd sensed before. There was a faint curve to her lips, not quite a smile, not quite not. She took the apple from my hand, slipping it gently into another bag. A faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, something woody with a trace of citrus, understated yet hard to ignore. "You live nearby?" I asked, trying not to sound like someone fishing for details. She glanced up at me then, her eyes steady, assessing but not cold. "Across the street," she said. Second floor. Balcony with the plants. The way she phrased it, it was like she already knew I'd noticed. I felt the corner of my mouth twitch into a half smile. Right, I said softly. I think I've seen you there. Her expression shifted, just a flicker, like the hint of amusement behind a composed mask. Have you? She said, and this time her smile did show, brief and light, the kind that leaves a trace long after it's gone. We finished gathering the last of the fruit. I offered to carry the bags to her building, but she shook her head, a polite refusal. I'm just around the corner, she said. But thank you. As she turned to leave, there was that small pause again, her eyes lingering just a fraction longer than necessary, as if leaving a thread between us. Then she walked away, her steps measured, the late afternoon light catching on her hair. I stood there a moment longer than I should have, the smoothness of that apple still ghosting against my palm, wondering why such a simple encounter felt like the start of something that didn't quite have a name. It was a rainy mid-morning when I saw her again, not planned, not expected. The cafe near the corner was one of those narrow places you almost miss if you don't know it's there, with steamed windows and the quiet hum of people speaking in low tones. I ducked in to escape the drizzle, ordered a black coffee, and turned to find a seat, only to realize every table was taken except one, half occupied. She was sitting there, reading a book with her cup already half empty, her hair slightly damp at the ends as if she'd just come in from the rain herself. When she looked up and recognized me, it wasn't surprise that crossed her face, but something closer to an easy familiarity, like we were neighbors who were supposed to meet here eventually. Crowded today, she said, closing the book with one finger between the pages. You can share, if you don't mind. I hesitated, just a heartbeat, but she was already pulling her bag a little closer to make space. I set my cup down, feeling oddly aware of the smallness of the table between us. The cafe smelled of ground beans and wet coats. Her bracelets clinked softly as she stirred what was left of her coffee, a motion as unhurried as the first time I'd seen her. We spoke of simple things at first, the weather, the street's early morning quiet, the book she was reading. Her voice carried a steady warmth, the kind that draws you in without trying to. I found myself watching her hands as she talked, how her fingers wrapped around the mug, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear without thinking about it. You're still settling in, aren't you? She said at one point. It wasn't really a question. Trying to, I admitted. Feels strange being the new one on a street where everyone already knows their rhythm. Her smile was small but not unkind. The street has its rhythm, she agreed. But it also has room. I caught myself glancing at her when I thought she wasn't looking, how the light from the window softened the fine lines around her eyes, how there was something quietly certain about the way she occupied space. But of course, she noticed. She didn't call me out. Not yet. Instead, her foot shifted under the table, brushing mine, lightly, briefly. Could have been accidental. Could have been anything. My chest tightened anyway. The conversation lingered longer than either of us planned, stretching past the point where the rain outside had slowed to a drizzle. When I finally rose to leave, she said, "You'll get used to the street. And the people on it." There was something in the way she said people, not just a word, but an opening, a thread waiting to be pulled. I stepped back out into the gray daylight with the taste of coffee still on my tongue and a quiet thought lodged somewhere in the back of my mind. She hadn't asked for my number, and I hadn't asked for hers. But neither of us had said goodbye like strangers either. Late afternoon had draped the street in a soft, golden haze when I found myself outside, watering the few plants I'd arranged along the side of my building. It wasn't much of a garden, just a narrow strip of soil by the fence, but it had become a small excuse to linger outside when the day was winding down. Across the fence, her balcony door was open, curtains swaying with the light breeze. I heard the creak of her gate before I saw her. She stepped out carrying a terracotta pot, something green and fragrant spilling over the edge. Her sandals made a gentle sound against the walkway as she approached, stopping just on the other side of the fence. "Thought this might suit your little garden," she said, holding out a small rosemary cutting wrapped in a bit of damp paper. Her hands were lightly soiled, nails short and clean, as if this was her ritual, tending, offering, rearranging the quiet spaces in her world. I reached to take it, fingers brushing against hers. The herb's needles pricked faintly against my skin, sharp but fragrant, releasing a smell that mingled with the evening air, warm, resinous, grounding. "Thank you," I said, though it came out quieter than I meant. She leaned an elbow against the top of the fence, eyes scanning my small row of plants with a faint curve at the corner of her mouth. "You're watching more than you're watering," she murmured, her voice low but not unkind. I felt heat creep up the back of my neck. "Just trying to figure out what survives here," I said, half a deflection, half true. That's when it happened. She caught my eyes, really caught them, and didn't let go. For a heartbeat, I thought she might look away, give me the out I didn't know I needed. But she didn't. Instead, her head tilted just slightly, that same quiet, knowing gesture I'd seen the first evening. "Don't look away," she said softly, almost as if it were a secret meant only for the space between us. A pause, then her voice deepened a shade. "I like when you stare." The words landed somewhere between playful and daring, yet there was no malice, no sharpness, just a hint of invitation. My fingers tightened slightly around the rosemary sprig, its scent rising stronger with the pressure. I wanted to answer, to say something clever or at least steady, but all I managed was a small, unsteady breath. She straightened, brushing her palms together as if nothing had just been said, the moment dissolving back into the hum of the neighborhood. "Plant it near the edge," she said, nodding toward the patch of soil at my feet. "It likes the sun." Then she turned, walking back toward her gate, leaving the air behind her charged in a way I couldn't quite name. The fence felt smaller after that, as though it wasn't just a boundary of wood and metal anymore, but a thin line between what had been polite distance and something else entirely. It had been one of those restless summer evenings, warm, heavy, carrying the promise of rain but refusing to break. I stepped outside hoping for air, pacing along the sidewalk, when the first drops finally began to fall. Not a storm at first, just a slow, insistent drizzle that kissed the pavement and darkened the edges of the street. By the time I looked up, the sky had shifted, gray bleeding into charcoal, and the rain quickened. Her voice carried across the soft rush of water. "You'll get soaked out there," she called from her balcony. I glanced up to see her leaning slightly over the railing, a light sweater draped over her shoulders, hair pulled back loosely. Before I could respond, she stepped aside, gesturing. "Come on, use the awning." I jogged across, the rain cool against my cheeks, and found myself standing beneath the overhang of her balcony. The space was narrow but dry, filled with the faint scent of wet rosemary and jasmine from the pots nearby. She stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, though neither of us moved to close the inch of air between our arms. For a moment, we said nothing. The rain filled the silence, its rhythm soft but steady against the street, dripping from leaves and gutters. She exhaled, a slow, measured breath, and then said, almost to herself, "I used to love nights like this. They made the city feel alive." There was a pause, one that felt like it could tip in any direction. I turned my head slightly, trying to read her profile. "Used to?" I asked. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "When I wasn't here alone," she said. No dramatics, no bitterness, just a quiet truth placed gently between us. "Divorce does strange things to time. You end up counting evenings instead of living them." I didn't know what to say at first. There was a part of me that wanted to fill the silence, to offer something comforting or clever, but the weight of her honesty asked for stillness instead. So I stayed there, listening to the rain, letting her words rest where they landed. Her sleeve brushed against mine, light, almost accidental. Or maybe it wasn't. The warmth of that faint touch traveled quicker than I expected, curling low in my chest. "It's quieter than I imagined," I said finally, my voice softer than the rain. She looked at me then, her eyes searching, not for reassurance, but perhaps for something steady in return. "It doesn't have to stay that way," she murmured, then turned her gaze back toward the street, as if the admission had slipped out before she could take it back. We stood there a while longer, shoulders almost touching, the rain cooling the air around us while something unspoken warmed the narrow space we shared. When the drizzle softened, I stepped back, unsure whether I should thank her for the shelter or for the moment. She gave a small nod, half farewell, half something else, and I walked home with the damp air clinging to my skin and her words echoing quietly behind me. The days that followed carried a strange stillness, like the air after rain, when the world feels washed but not yet rearranged. We had shared dinners that almost became something more, glances that lingered too long, pauses that begged for words neither of us had been ready to speak. And then there was space, unspoken, but not unfriendly. It was a Sunday afternoon when the knock came. Gentle, unhurried, like a question asked softly so it could be refused without wounding. I opened the door to find her standing there, hair swept back casually, a faint flush on her cheeks from the cool air. In her hands were 2 cups, steam rising faintly. "I made tea," she said, her tone somewhere between casual and careful. "Thought you might like some company." There was no hesitation this time. I stepped aside, letting her in. The apartment was warmer than the street, and she looked around briefly as if reacquainting herself with a space she'd only glimpsed in passing. We settled by the window, the same window where it had started, the view across the street now softened by the late light. She handed me the cup. The porcelain was warm against my palms, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. "You've stopped looking over so much," she said quietly, her eyes on the street below. I let out a small breath, unsure whether it was a question or an observation. "Didn't want to overstep," I admitted. "Didn't want to turn a quiet thing into something heavy." Her fingers toyed with the rim of her cup, thumb tracing slow circles. "Sometimes," she said, "quiet things are just waiting for someone to stop pretending they're not there." The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full, of all the moments that had led here, of every glance, every brush of fingers, every almost confession that had hung between us. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I'd seen her do a dozen times but now felt deliberate, revealing rather than hiding. When she rested her hand lightly on my sleeve, it was nothing more than that, light, steady, warm. "You don't have to look away anymore," she murmured. "Not if you don't want to." I placed my fingers over hers, not claiming, not pressing, just meeting her halfway. The city hummed softly outside, the world still moving at its own rhythm, but here, by the window, time folded into something slower, something real. We didn't speak of what would come next, not in promises, not in plans. It wasn't about rushing forward. It was about sitting in the presence of something that had finally settled into its shape, not a fleeting curiosity, not a game of glances, but a quiet understanding that neither of us needed to escape from. The tea cooled between our hands. The light shifted on the street. And for the first time since that evening on the balcony, I didn't feel like I was intruding on her world. I felt like I'd been invited in.